Welcome back to the second course stream of this week. Where had we left off? Well, we had talked about the Angel Island Detention Center, but of course we also need to talk a little bit about San Francisco Chinatown, or Tangrenjie. The term Chinatown is really interesting because in Chinese the term Chinatown actually translates as the road where people from the Tang Empire live. The Tang Dynasty, of course, was one of the golden ages in Chinese civilization, even preceded the starting date of our class. It's really the 7th, 8th, 9th century. And there was a time when China was very cosmopolitan, when a lot of foreigners lived in China, when a lot of Chinese lived outside of the Chinese empire. So it's at that time really that the idea of Chinatowns started to emerge. Of course, not in the West, in other Asian countries, more in the proximity of China. But the Chinese always referred to these communities where Chinese people lived outside of China as Tangrenjie. So here we call it Chinatown, right? And the Chinatown in San Francisco, of course, is the oldest Chinatown in North America and the largest Chinese enclave outside of Asia. It was established in 1848 by immigrants, mostly from Guangzhou and Fujian, right, the south. Prior to the invention of the cable car, hillside property in San Francisco was least desirable. So properties in Chinatown used to be relatively less expensive than elsewhere because they are, of course, all on that hill. Now, after the 1906 earthquake, efforts by civic groups to relocate Chinatown to elsewhere were met by resistance from the people in Chinatown, from overseas Chinese who provided funds for the rebuilding of Chinatown, right? In 1906, cable cars had, of course, been invented, and in a way, Chinatown had become a prime location, if you want. But Chinatown is rebuilt right there where it had stood originally, but it was already then consciously made into an exotic destination for Americans to dine and to shop. So temples and Chinese roofs were added, and some of those, of course, we still see in Chinatown today. Again, if you have never been to Chinatown in San Francisco, please get on the tram tonight for some fabulous Chinese food in Chinatown and to explore this wonderfully diverse cultural hub at the heart of our city. Now, we've read some poems, a lot of which are actually quite painful, right? Those poems left by Chinese at the detention center, and poems that really leave a stain on that Sino-Western relationship. Now, I want to read some other poems with you that shed a different kind of light on that Sino-Western relationship in the 20th century. So let's first talk about Ezra Pound and the reception of Chinese poetry in early 20th Europe and America. First, we got to talk about Ernest Fenollosa, who was a Catalan-American professor of philosophy and political economy at Tokyo University in Japan. And while in Japan, Fenollosa becomes interested in Japanese art. He helps to establish Tokyo Fine Arts Academy and Imperial Museum. But he also becomes interested in Chinese poetry, which of course also enjoys a very high cultural status in Japan. And he starts to translate some of that poetry. He starts to write a book about Chinese characters in general. And when he passes away, his widow passed his notes on to Ezra Pound, one of the most famous modern poets in the English language of the 20th century. And these notes included a book called The Chinese Written Character as a Medium for Poetry, and it becomes the foundation for Pound's work of poetry called Cathay, in which he translated / rewrote a lot of those Chinese poems which Fenollosa had started to translate. Ezra Pound, on a side note, if you haven't studied him in your high school English classes, of course, an American poet and critic who lived in Europe and England and Italy. He became a fascist sympathizer later on, which is why we're not going to talk too much about him, but he is a major figure in the early modernist poetry movement, and he helped to develop Imagism, a movement that drew its inspiration in part from classical Chinese poetry. It was so important that in 1928, T.S. Eliot called Pound the inventor of Chinese poetry for our time. And of course we have to read one of Ezra Pound's translations / rewritings after a poem by Li Bai, one of the most famous Chinese tongue poets. Taking leave of a friend, blue mountains to the north of the walls, white river winding about them, here we must make separation and go out through 1,000 miles of dead grass. Mind like a floating wide cloud, sunset like the parting of old acquaintances, who bow over their clasped hands at a distance. Our horses neigh to each other as we are departing. And now let's look at a Chinese poet, Zhimo, 1897 to 1931, so a near contemporary of Ezra Pound. And he is usually considered the greatest modern Chinese poet of the 20th century. Now, driven by the ideas of the May 4th movement we talked about a minute ago, Zhimo sets out to break with the rigid poetic conventions of the past. And he wants nothing less than to reinvent Chinese poetry and to create a new poetic language. He studies economics in New York, but that's because his dad wanted him to do that. His dad was a banker. But then he travels to Cambridge in England to dedicate himself to literature and the arts. And he finds inspiration for this new kind of poetic language in English romantic poetry. And he admires especially the celebration of romantic love and the emphasis on the individual. And just like Ezra Pound translated Chinese poetry, and those translations in a way took on a new life in the West, Zhimo translated a lot of Western poetry, and that poetry likewise took on a new life in China, helped to shape a new poetic language in China. And I'm just going to give you one example, a poem that he translated, a poem by Christina Rossetti, an important female romantic poet. And what I'm going to do is play for you a Chinese rendering of Zhimo's translation of the poem in song. Now let's leave it at that. Of course, if you're interested in poetry and you're interested in either of these two poets, you could do your final project on either of them or even both of them. Now, one more fun poet I want to introduce you to is Langston Hughes, who of course is the poet laureate of the Harlem Renaissance, one of the most important African-American poets of the 20th century, who visited Shanghai, China in 1934 on a tour around the world. Now at that time, Langston Hughes was already very well known, and Madame Sun Yat-sen, the widow of Sun Yat-sen, Sun Zhongshan, right, the first president of the Chinese Republic, wanted to meet him, invited him for dinner at her house in the French concession of Shanghai. He was so famous that even Lu Xun, the most famous Chinese writer of the time, wanted to meet him. And this is what Langston Hughes had to say about his visit in Shanghai. I found the Chinese in Shanghai to be a very jolly people, much like colored folks at home. To tell the truth, I was more afraid of going into the world-famous Cathay Hotel, which was a hotel for white foreigners, imperialists in Shanghai, than I was going into any public place in the Chinese quarters. Colored people are not welcomed at the Cathay, but beyond the gates of the international settlement, color was no barrier. I could go anywhere. And then this is from his book, I Wonder as I Wander, which is sort of a chronicle of his tour around the world. Great read. I can strongly recommend it. But Langston Hughes also wrote a poem about his time in China. And in the poem, he sympathizes with the Chinese who suffer from imperialism, who suffer from essentially Western encroachment and capitalism. And let's read the opening together. The poem is called Raw China, which he composed after seeing a woodblock print that was also called Raw China, and that was done by a Chinese artist. Raw China, raw old lion of the east, snort fire, yellow dragon of the orient, tired at last of being bothered. Since when did you ever steal anything from anybody? Sleepy, wise old beast, known as the porcelain maker, known as the poem maker, known as maker of firecrackers. A long time since you cared about taking other people's lands away from them. They must have thought you didn't care about your own land either, so they came with gunboats, set up concessions, zones of influence, international settlements, missionary houses, banks, and Jim Crow YMCAs. They beat you with Malacca canes and dared you to raise your head except to cut it off. If you want to read the whole poem, I have it here on the PowerPoint. Now, the last person I want to introduce you to in our last lecture is this gentleman here, Kaiyu Xu, or Xu Jieyu, 1922 to 1982. He studied in Kunming during the Second World War, the war of resistance against Japanese. He then came to California as a translator for Chinese pilots who were being trained in California by the US Air Force. He then stayed on. He obtained a PhD degree at Stanford, and later he founded the Chinese program at San Francisco State. So it's really because of him that we are all in this class together. He was also the author of many books on Chinese literature, art, and culture. He really was a cultural figure, very much like Matteo Ricci, who loved the West, who loved China, and who wanted to be a bridge between cultures. And now it's up to you. You are the ones who will decide the future of Sino-Western relations. I hope if there's one thing that you have taken away from this class, it is that the world is a far better place when China and the West treat each other with respect, and Westerners and Chinese alike are willing to learn from each other. So we should all follow the example of people like Matteo Ricci or Kaiyu Xu. And I'm going to leave you with a painting which I invite you all to go and see. It hangs in the Dean's office of the College of Liberal and Creative Arts. And it is a painting that Kaiyu Xu did. Kaiyu Xu lived in Tiburon, and this was the view from his office, from his study, overlooking the San Francisco Bay, seeing Angel Island, seeing the sun rise over the bay, and rendering it with a Chinese brush. So this, I think, is really a fitting conclusion to our class on Sino-Western relations. I hope you enjoyed our journey, and of course, I look forward to your final projects.